Hey folks, Chef Eduardo Garcia, longtime lover of food, culinarian by profession and by, I guess, passion and choice. I'm here with all of you to talk about the Meatcrafter knife. I've got a Whitetail hind shank here that I'm going to clean up and break down. So both as a chef, both as a hunter, when I'm approaching a dish, I'm shopping and thinking about what my end meal is. Where do I want to take this raw material? How am I going to process it, prepare it, cook it, season it, and then celebrate it on the table? So for the shank is an interesting cut in that we can see this show up in our meal plan and in our culinary work in a variety of ways. I feel like when I first started working with the shank, I was really kind of just focused on getting all the red meat off of here, removing all of this fascia, all of this silver skin. We can see this big tendon. The idea was I'm going to take all the red meat off of here by trimming all the silver skin, all the connective tissue. And I had to tell you, it takes a long time. One of the ways that you can speed that up is you start with a very sharp knife. And you can also cook the shank whole, right? And so you don't necessarily have to strip all the meat off. And I feel like now, as a cook, I've matured in my approach to the shank, and my most cooked and preferred method of shank cookery is going to be a slow and low braise. So a slow and low braise I like for two reasons. Primarily, it's the most flavorful expression of the shank because we're keeping the bone, which has the contribution of marrow. There's a ton of flavor, a ton of nutrients in the interior of that bone. Also the tendon and the connective tissue that's on the inside of all of these strands of muscle. In the slow cookery of a braise, all that connective tissue, the bone and the marrow, all end up breaking down. The muscle itself will break down, it'll become tender, and the sauce or the gravy will have been built on the ruins of the cartilage and the silver skin and the tendon and the bone and the marrow, which means you got a really good foundation for a very flavorful dish. So the first thing we're going to do to this shank, though, is we're going to give it a look, make sure there's no hair on here, and we're going to start the process of removing silver skin. So the way that I was taught to remove silver skin is start on one end of like your working platform. So at the shank, I'm going to start on this end. And I use the tip of the knife, and I appreciate that the select edge 14-degree angle on this Meatcrafter is going to give me a very fine insertion point into the muscle of the shank, which can be kind of tough. Like this shank is kind of like this form, it gets worked a lot. And so it's a strong muscle to work through. And of course the tendons and cartilage and connective tissue, it really is a bit of a chore for even a sharp knife to work through. So having that fine edge is going to be the right choice of blade for breaking down a lot of connective tissue, for cleaning up a shank like this. I get the very tip of my Meatcrafter and I'm gonna slide it underneath, and you'll see that if I go too deep, I'm gonna end up cutting a lot of the muscle, and I don't want that. I wanna keep the muscle for dinner. So we wanna make this, you wanna take the blade and you can almost push up with a slight angle. And what that's gonna do is that's gonna bring the edge of the blade up against the silver skin, and the silver skin, kind of like how I'm rubbing it against the hook here, that silver skin is going to act as a guide that guides the edge of this knife to remove silver skin from the muscle. This sounds complex. I'll just show you. Let's do this. Tip goes in. You see how I'm kind of getting it as far over as I can to get a nice strip, so about 1/2 inch. And then I'm leaning up while also pushing away. And you can see how the silver skin is releasing just right off the top of the muscle. That's what we want. And you'll get faster at this as you go along. But this is what we're doing. We're just removing the very top layer here. So I'll come back to that first cut. Same thing, coming backwards. The blade of your knife you want tilted just slightly past parallel, favoring up. That pushes the edge of the blade against the silver skin, leaving as much muscle as possible on this bone. Silver skin is one of the things we're looking for. I'm looking for hair, I'm looking for grass from the field. I mean, if you've butchered an animal in the field before and you brought the muscles home, we've thawed it out months later and you're gonna make a meal, just give it a look. Make sure there's not a pine needle that's gonna stick in your mother-in-law's mouth when she takes a nice bite of her roast or her stew. We don't really want that in our meal. So here we go. So you'll see how I'm changing my technique a little bit from going under and pulling out, by now just making sort of slicing motions. And again, I'm pushing against that silver skin that's helping me guide this knife. And we'll just keep working on this. I gotta tell you, I really appreciate the slightly textured handle. It feels well sat in my hand, if that's what it feels like. It's just like sat in my hand, it's comfortably weighted. It feels like it's supposed to be here. I like that, that's what we want with a knife. So you get to the bone here, so we're not gonna need to take any attention to the bone. That'll just be a part of our gravy. We won't end up eating anything there, so we don't need to clean the bone at all. Okay, so this side looks pretty good. So it's an interesting angle because you can't really get your knife in there flat. So I'll have to turn it a little and end up just playing the edge of this blade up to that bone. Appreciate it. I'm almost flexing that blade here, so it's under the skin, and yet I have this muscle right here, and I want that top pressure for the blade to come up against the silver skin. So I'm actually applying it pressure, and I can feel that blade bend a little. So with a boning knife or a knife that's meant for doing bone work and butchery, you should feel that flex in that blade. There we go. Well, that side looks good. Flip it over and do the exact same. And you can see here also the discoloration. So this is where the meat has oxidized, and so we'll also want to remove any oxidized meat from this cut. Your primary hand plus knife is part of the equation. The other part of the equation is your remaining hand, and pulling on that silver skin is going to truly help you with this method. So make a starting cut, lift it up, get underneath it, point my blade up into the silver skin, trying to take as little muscle off as possible. So take a look at this. See that little strip right here? So the reason that we want to remove the silver skin, you can see how we've removed a lot of it, yet when we go inside these muscles, the way that the shank is built, it's a lot of vertical muscle strands that are in like a silver skin sleeping bag, I guess. So there's a lot of them in here. Well, we could take a knife like this and we could scrape each one of these silver skins free of all that muscle and just have the meat. We want to cook it on the bone. We want it to stay whole like this, but we just want to do our best to remove as much accessible silver skin off the outside, so we'll get this last little bit. And the reason for removing this is it will break down, it will add flavor to our gravy, but it will never fully get as tender as the meat itself. And so when we're thinking about our end dish and our end diner, you think about that slow cooked like stew with a big thick gravy that's flavored with root veggies. We want that falling apart, tender and melting in your mouth, and not chewy with a bunch of gristle and silver skin. So that's why we're taking some time to remove what we can. That's a good looking shank, cleaned up. So from here, if you were gonna do a braised ossobuco or a slow braised venison shank, next step would be to add your seasonings of choice, brown all sides, and then cook it low and slow in a nice wet aromatic environment. Our hind shank of a whitetail venison has been cleaned up. We pulled all that silver skin, a few pieces of hair, a couple pieces of dirt, all gone. The Meatcrafter, a perfect tool for deboning, that's where we went with it. Also removing silver skin, working your way through sort of fine little nooks and crannies. The flex in the blade, I talked to the designer at Benchmade about this, and what he shared with me is that the top spine of the knife, where they've removed some of that mass so it's a little thinner, that's what helps this blade bend. And that's gonna come in handy when you're butchering. So fully customizable, from the metal on the blade to the finish on the metal to the material in the handle, even the color accent on the pivot. It's gonna be a workhorse for many years to come for you. Hope you enjoy cooking and cutting with that. This shank looks good.